Right, so what do you think on this? I'll let you start this topic then. That is a very famous stereotype that even though by this time we'd already had Apex, was still sort of lingering around Overwatch. The premise went that, okay, it's like Westerners only like give up ground slowly. So they were like, right, well, obviously they're amazing at RTS because, spoiler, Korea was just the best in RTS from day one. So, okay, RTS ground seeded. Well, that's all right though, because in the MOBA games like Dota, all the Westerners and that's Chinese, oh shit, yeah, they're the best at like the MOBA. Fuck, right. Well, I tell you what, FPS, they can't aim with crosshairs though, can they? Yeah, just all those spells and MOBAs. You know what, Koreans, leave the fucking FPS to us. That's us, the Americans. Like, and the joke is like, well, how would you describe it, Gio? In Overwatch, how good were Koreans?
So it's funny because with Overwatch really being like my first esport, but also my first exposure to esports, really, like I came into an environment where Koreans were worshipped. They were the majority. I think obviously there are a few NA teams who very early on were like, really good. Like we've mentioned Envy before as an example of that. But, having like these teams like GC Busan or like Kongdu Panthera or like Lunatic High, as you mentioned, whatever, like are names that people were still talking about like quite a bit later as really sowing the seed. And what was it? It was in the second year of the Overwatch League where a lot of people were saying like over half of the players in the entire league were Korean. Yep. And that was I don't know if controversy is the word, but there were some people who didn't give a shit and there were some people who were not happy about it because they were like, this is crazy. Like all of these teams going to lose spots for the Westerners, and it's like, okay, well, play better. But it's kind of a strange one because for me, like coming into an esport where like a first-person shooter esport where Korea was by far and away indisputably the dominant region, it was actually weirder for me to then step into other esports where that wasn't the case. So actually, like something I really took a lot of interest in when I went into Rainbow Six was the Korean region, because I was like, I've just come from an esport where Koreans are so much better than everyone else on average, and it is a tiny little region in Rainbow Six, and I want to see how that development can go. And actually, funnily enough, one of the best teams in the world right now is a Korean team. Like that development has happened in Rainbow Six. But I feel like I've almost had like that backwards experience there because I didn't really have like the context of all of these other esports and stuff. I wasn't interested in MOBAs or RTS games. Like I only cared about FPS games, and that just happened to be the one that I stepped into. So I got like sort of red pilled a little bit, I guess, when I started like, getting involved in other esports.
Because if people don't know, when Overwatch began, me and Monty tried telling everyone, like, Koreans are going to be the best. It's just, it's when, not if, right? And they all just kept telling us, like, it's a different game, even though I come from bloody CSGO. And as I took, like, in fact, here's a bit of insight, because obviously it's a similar game. The reason I know Koreans will be amazing in these games is because even in the games they're not into as a culture, they, as I say, will have one or two teams who just inexplicably are way better than they should be. So you can actually go back, there's a really mad example, no one knows, 'cause it's just so old school, I don't bring it up. In Quake, think about that, the most Western esport of all time, by the way. It's what started esports in the West, was Quake. 1v1 Quake dueling, right, is one of the hardest games ever, not just because of how like it's skill dependent the game is, but crucially, the tactics of it are heavily around who you practice with, because essentially if you don't ever play with certain players, like their approach to the game and how they control the maps is like totally different, right? So what's crazy is in one of the first giant Quake 3 tournaments, that was like a world championship in 2000, a random Korean guy no one had ever heard of rocked up to this event, finished third in the event, ahead of, by the way, like people who in past versions of Quake were like champions before this version of Quake came out, then just fucked off back to Korea and was essentially never heard of ever again. And everyone, I remember, even was just going like, who even is this guy and who's he practicing with? And like, what's mad is all you need to know is even back then, Achilles, even though he was a Korean guy that no one heard of, he had a manager. That's all you need to know about Korean esports. Like, this is essentially what they don't get is, in the West, when everyone complains, like in League of Legends is a very common complaint, like, well, we can't be the best because we don't practice the best. Koreans don't think like that. Even if they know they actually don't have the best practice environment, they will diligently practice as if they were in the best practice environment. Like in CS, in Counter-Strike, if people don't know, the version before CSGO, these players I was just referring to, Solo, Glow, Termi, Perry, when they were playing, they used to be in a scene that had one other team that was vaguely international level, and they didn't even practice them because they had a rivalry with them. What these teams were doing, this is not a joke, is they would would just dry run stuff in an empty server. You have to realize in the West, you sometimes do that if you're like the in-game leader and you just want to test something out, right? They would, as a total team, go into an empty server and dry run all the flashes and the timings of turning away and do it. And all they worked on basically was they knew we don't have the practice, so why not just work on execution? And the mad thing is, it's almost like that fucking scene in the movie Old Boy, you know, where he's like, does it actually work to watch violence? And then would it work? It's like it worked. It actually worked in real life, though, when you practiced all this shit, like to get the timings down perfectly. They would do it against the Western teams and it would work. And so, believe it or not, the one edge they had was they actually took their tactical like execution to the level of the best European teams. And so these teams could go in like the mid 2000s and they could like have a run where they'd finish second at like a major tournament and stuff like this was possible. So if you know that can happen in games that Korea doesn't care about, that's why in games like League of Legends or fucking Overwatch, the Koreans just dominate. Because there's one other factor, I want to ask you about this actually, Achilles. You can explain it better than me. You live in Korea. I always say it like this, right? It's not as simple as just look at the PC bank stat. It's also about sort of like, essentially, Koreans have quite a homogenous culture. Like everyone sort of gets into the same music, the same fucking variety shows they watch every night, same celebrities, the same gossip, but as a result, the same games. Like what they do is they seem to pick a couple of games and everyone fucking plays that game. And then if you're like in the fourth best game, like the drop-off's like that, isn't it? Like it's just, it's like the difference between everyone caring about League and a game like Valorant coming along. How would you compare the two?
I mean, I think it's been a little bit of a slow start here with Valorant. And I mean, that's a combination of a couple different things. There was the Vanguard system that came out, and that was really fucked.
The anti-cheat thing must have been a problem, yeah.
Yeah, the anti-cheat was really, really an issue because in order to get it to work, like PC bongs were having to set aside like sections of the PC bong that are like, well, those are the Vanguard PCs. We have it running. It's working. And now Valorant can be played on it. But like if somebody restarts the PC, like everything could get...
Wasn't the logic something like it was sort of like it was too intensive as an anti-cheat, basically? So I think you even maybe had to like run it as admin or something weird, right? Something like that. And so if people don't know, in those PC cafes, this is the other thing that how it works in Korea. You don't go to the PC cafe and go, hey, have you heard about that game? Let's download it now. You go and whatever's on the PC, it's almost like Netflix. You just go and you see what's available and you go, oh, let's play this game here. So you either play League, because everyone says let's play League or StarCraft, or you look what's on the PC. So if what's on the PC is like Street Fighter, fucking FIFA, you just play or Crossfire instead of CSGO, you play Crossfire. Like that's like essentially if you're not on these PC ban cafes, you're in trouble, right?
Yeah. So there was the issue with that, but then also obviously like the game came out during COVID, and eventually what happened was PC bongs and everything in the country was like, okay, well now we start closing at 9 p.m.
Oh,
That's
right.
not PC bong hours.
Yes.
That's not PC bong hours. PC bong hours are when, the kids have they go to their school, then they go home, then they go to their after school, their hagwon. They study there, and then they're like, okay, now I can go to the PC bong. And then they'll play until whatever time in the morning, and then they'll go to bed, they'll wake up, they do it all over again. So the PC bong numbers are very much not that trustworthy these days. But also, I think that that early harm with Vanguard and the timing of it all during COVID, like really hurt what could have been an initial spurt of growth for the game. Because Koreans do like to play a lot of FPS. PUBG is still in the top 10. Yes. People play Crossfire. There's like Black Squad. There's Sudden Attack. Point blank.
If you ever look at the raw numbers for those like CS clones, it's crazy how big they are. Like it's just they're not esports is the problem. They're sort of like more casual games. Yeah, that's the problem.
I think most people don't realize that like Crossfire is like the number one most played game in the world.
Yes, loads of Chinese people I think play it as well, right?
Korean made, and it's just like this enormous game. So like Koreans do like to play, but I think that what we're seeing now is actually a lot more people playing from home, because I think a lot of families and people said like, okay, I can't go out to the PC bar. Like we need to have a home PC, whether that's for kids to study and then they also utilize that to play games, et cetera, whatever. I think that we are seeing have been seeing a large increase of at-home play compared to where prior, when PC bongs were just 24/7, you could very easily rely on the numbers to tell you everything that you need to know about, what the current power rankings are. I think they still hold a lot of power, but it doesn't tell the full truth anymore like it once did. But yeah, I think that right now we're kind of at this point where in order to really see a spurt of growth for the game to continue to surge forward, I think that we basically just need to win something. I think that if DRX goes and wins Masters, I think we'll see an immediate jump in both the viewership and the player numbers, because Koreans, like, you know, they love when Korea does well at something. You watch the Olympics, whenever there's a Korean on the Olympics, like every TV is turned to the Olympics. Everybody's paying attention to that. And then as soon as like that person's done competing, they're like, okay, well, we'll just go back to drinking or eating or whatever. We don't have to pay attention to the Olympics until the next Korean comes up. If DRX and Korea can start really competing and winning tournaments on a global level, I think that more people are going to be like, oh, I need this.
Oh, wait a second. Something's happening to your mic there. For some reason, that last sentence you said, it started cutting some words out. Is the mic cable got pulled or something? Say the last sentence again. It was after you said something about like winning like, the regional tournament. Yeah. It cut like on the word that we were trying to hear though. So it's like, what was the word? So say that last bit again if you can.
So basically, I was just saying that Koreans really love when they see Koreans winning. So I think that if they can take an international event, everybody will be like, holy shit, like we're really good at this game now. And they'll want to pay attention to it and they'll want to play it themselves. And I think that that will very much instill a large amount of growth into the Valorant scene here in Korea. That plus now that we have, you know, live audiences and whatnot going on, I think that that's also going to very much help.
Yeah, along those lines, by the way, I'll tell a quick anecdote. I was actually telling them this before it started, but if people don't know, what really showed me how wild this approach to following Korean athletes is, was actually when in soccer, in European football, there were some players from Korea that actually were able to go to the Premier League, and one of them played for Man United. And if people don't know, I once went and watched a game in a bar where it was with Korean commentary, but it was of the Man United Premier League game. And essentially the joke is, because I don't know Korean, obviously all I'm hearing is when they say the name of the player that I know is Korean. And the joke is, I remember asking like Monty or something like, why did they say his name like 5 times a sentence? And they told me basically the casting over there would essentially be like I'll have to make a random name up because I can't remember this guy's name, but let's say his name was like Seong-min. They were like, Seong-min gets the ball, he passes it up, Seong-min runs around the defender, will he receive it back? He gets it back, Seong-min passes it on, and the header comes from the player who received the ball from Seong-min and he scored, and Seong-min with the pass. And it's like essentially, because they know that you only care about that one player, they find a way to like just crowbar that player into every sentence. It's like they made it sound like he was like the linchpin of every single thing that happened in the fucking game. And so essentially though, you realise, I agree with Achilles. Essentially, like low-key, they just follow success. They're like Americans in that way to some degree. Like Americans will do the same thing. If they have a sport they don't care about, but they get a world champion in it, everyone suddenly gives all the fucks about that game until all of a sudden they're not that good again. And then, like for example, that's why no one gives a fuck about tennis anymore, isn't it? Because there's no top American player now. Magically, they don't care now that all Europeans dominate. So anyway, the other thing to say is this. There's actually one other detail, but obviously Achilles has to be careful about his opinion about this particular topic. Or does he? Who knows? Just put that out there. The other thing that would actually, by the way, tomorrow help Valorant, but obviously careful how you feel about this, is if Overwatch doesn't keep doing very well, that would absolutely, I'm not joking, tomorrow make like loads of players start playing Valorant fight against Achilles. Because if people don't know about Korean players, when they start playing as pros, it's really hard to get them to stop. As in, if people don't know, there are people to this day playing in StarCraft in like obscure orgs in like fucking like Europe and like China and stuff. They play to this day because they're set on that path. Just the fact the game got smaller doesn't stop them. They're diligent people. They try to work and be number one. That's their mentality. So I think if Overwatch like dies off a bit, or there's maybe if there was even harder getting the visas or something, I think you'll see a whole bunch more come over, because there's not many at the moment. Actually, there's only a couple from Overwatch in the league right now, right?
I mean, at least in Korea, yeah, the main two are going to be Zoomba and Bazzi. And that was going to bring me to a point is like, not only do you have people who, you know, obviously there are people who are fans of Overwatch and, you know, maybe wouldn't otherwise watch Valorant, but those people are also typically fans of a player, in, you know, an individual player. There's so many fans here who just will, rather than support like an entire team, you might just kind of focus in on this one player and be like, that's the person who I support. It's sort of like being like a Tom Brady fan. You know, no matter where Tom Brady ends up, you're going to be like, okay, well, I'll support that team because he's the best quarterback in the world. You know, so it could be like that. And we've already seen a lot of fans come over from the Overwatch scene that have just been paying attention to Bazzi from when he was, you know, playing on 7 in Contender 2018. Then he moved on to the Spark. Then he comes over to here. Same with Zimba, who is an Apex, you know, player from back in the day out here. He's been playing Overwatch competitively for years and years. Was one of the top tank players out there, and then now he's shifted over. And there are people who just watch Valorant because they are fans of those players. If Overwatch were to die, and suddenly you have this massive influx of all of these players who are currently in Overwatch, and they say like, well, I need another game to play. I really like FPS. Valorant's the up and coming thing. And they join in. all of that fandom is going to carry over because the fans do genuinely care about those players just cool. as individuals. So that would also be a massive influx. Obviously, I don't wish the death of any game.
Of course.
So that's totally fine. But if nature runs its course, then that's what will happen, I suppose.
Yes.
We just have to wait and see.
Yeah, if people don't know, by the way, that is also a very interesting detail about Korean fans, is even though obviously there are lots of men that follow the game and are fans as well, the fans that you might have seen if you've ever watched a broadcast that are the ones cheering and at the front of the crowd and giving the gifts, they're actually usually like teenage girls.
Always
and
women.
The way they tend
hiding
to actually
behind
support...
their signs.
The way they tend to support the players, though, is like Achilles says, it's more about the personality. Like they already have the concept. It's called idol culture from the K-pop stars. They sort of support players like that. Like the idea is the person's more a fan of, I don't know, Faker's story in League of Legends or his personality, more than like just like, wow, I really love like hardcore LeBlanc player or whatever. Like they're not usually as hardcore in that sense. So I imagine those people, it'd be perfectly logical in swap game if their favourite player moves over and he's still a pro, you can still watch him. You can, in this case, you can even go to the old bloody OGN park. Like it's all working. Points, it's all going to work. It could all work out. By the way, Gio, if you have any questions at any point, just jump in. I'll let you direct when you want to go on this.
So one thing that I am actually curious about, just given the fact that obviously you yourself are American and have worked in America, and but you are very well acquainted with the Korean scene, a really big discussion that I see mostly between like EU versus NA, but I think it's relevant here as well, is like, how is the culture different, like the mindset culture different that makes like this region perform better than this region? And I've seen it a lot with people saying like, oh, well, you know, like NA, it's just like they just care about the wrong things and they don't like want to practice, and like EU is so much more disciplined, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, you know, we're talking about this in the context of like games where Koreans seem to have this like really unique way of like approaching their practice and yes. And like we said, like even in a game where maybe they're not the dominant region, there are still going to be certain teams that appear to be dominant teams as individuals. Like how have you like experienced or perceived the difference in like the culture, quote unquote, between the, you know, the players of each region be?
I mean, right now there's the running gag of, you know, Sentinels never practice and whatnot. And, you know, not to even remotely say that that's correct.
It's a good caricature though for what people think of the region. Yeah,
I'd say like no matter what, like Korea does practice more than just about anybody who's out there, especially DRX, you know, Onslayers, the teams that are at the top, they are consistently grinding. And there's always been, since, you know, you go back to the times of the LCK versus like the LCS and whatnot, people will cry out and be like, well, it's ridiculous how much the LCK practices. Like, that's unhealthy. Yes. They grind too much. It's totally unreasonable that they do that. And we can't expect, you know, North American players or EU players to do the same thing. It's like, okay, that's totally fine. And I get it. And to a degree, you're probably right. They probably are playing too much. But at the same point, you also should never expect that NA or EU will ever win a championship ever. Because if they don't want to put in similar hours and have a similar growth from practice, and like they will never be able to conquer these teams. They'll never be able to beat China and Korea because they are going to put their all into winning. That's what is important to them. That's what they care about. So if you're not willing to try to even come close to matching, then you're going to have a really rough time. In Valorant, like we said, it's kind of just a matter of time as this region becomes more and more competitive and catches up internationally. That same problem very well could come to fruition. You know, if suddenly there are 5-6 great teams here in Korea and they're all practicing against each other, they're all putting in similar hours, NA and EU may very well have struggles when it comes down to squaring off against them. I think we're still a little ways out, obviously, from that happening. We still need to see Korea be a dominant force, win a tournament. But that can absolutely be an inevitability if people start resting on their laurels and thinking like, well, you know, we practice in the best region right now. That just because that's the case, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, you know, down the line. I remember one of the things that really frustrated me back during like contenders at the start of the Overwatch League was the idea of there being a map pool. I think that's still something that frustrates me now, you know, in the Overwatch League, because they've announced that there's going to be one for the new season and whatnot. And it's, I don't know, people always complain like there's so many maps to try to practice and so many game modes. And I'm like, well, all these fucking Korean teams are doing it. It's definitely possible that you could put in the hours to learn these and have strategies and be up to date on what the meta is map over map. Like, teams were doing it throughout all of Apex. Teams were doing it in contenders at the start when we didn't have a map pool. It was just open. And I think it makes it so much more interesting when you are going into a series and you have that map draft. Like being able to have that openness and have to put in the work to be good or at least adequate on every single map of the game, I think should kind of be a standard. But
that's, I mean, it's just to jump in, like, it's interesting you say, I think I mentioned this on last week's episode, but in Rainbow Six, they've just increased the map pool from 7 maps to 9 maps. The competitive map pool, that is. And that was something that actually a lot of pros wanted. And I was in favor of it as well. But one of the really interesting things I think about having a map pool and what that can do in terms of like being able to judge which teams are really good and which teams are not going to perform so well at international events notably, is you end up with teams that are like good best of one I know best of ones aren't really in Valorant, but like good best of 1 teams or good best of 3 teams or good best of 5 teams, right? Because you'll get your teams that like have 3 or 4 maps where they really have, but then they've got some glaring weaknesses on other maps. So on like the smaller series, like they can actually perform really well. So often those are teams that are like amazing domestically. And then as soon as you get into like international competition where you're playing in these bigger playoff brackets with like bigger series, like actually that's where you start to see those weaknesses. And like, in my opinion, I think that is almost arguably an important part of being able to judge competition, because like you shouldn't be able to just hide that and it not be a contributing factor to your performance.
Yes. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.